So despite single-digit market shares in practically every global region where they're available, Google really has a strong foothold in the smartphone space. But why? I guess we're going to figure it out together in this video. Do me a solid though, if you love Pixel content, Android content, Google content, then how about hitting that subscribe button? It really helps me out more than you know, and I'd love to have you as part of a growing community of like-minded individuals. Cheers. So with the Pixel, I think Google has not exactly hit the heights of its competitors. Rightly or wrongly, Samsung is the de facto leader in practically every area of non-Apple smartphones. Sales, perception, and everything else on top. I don't think that's really something we can argue about. It would take a miracle, though, for Google to topple their biggest smartphone maker on the planet. But the company still manages to strong-arm its way into the conversation when we talk about the best smartphones out there. And that's something we want to try and work out here. Besides Android, we actually talk about Pixel more than any other smartphone here on this channel, which is odd, right? Given just how small it is as a sliver within this space. But let's rewind a little bit first to try and understand why that's the case. So if you remember the Nexus lineup, well, the Nexus lineup is now long gone. The developer phone experiment was not really much of a success. It did, however, set a precedent that the Pixel continues with. It was a phone made for Google and with the default Android build pre-installed upon it. No extras, no added flavor, just that plain experience. And while the Pixel lineup has never really been set up to fully emulate that developer-focused software experience, it sort of has become the follow-up in lots of ways. It is Google's unedited vision of what Android on a mobile phone should be, running on hardware designed to deliver the best possible experience for that. You don't always get the extra bells and whistles included, nor is it the most feature-rich right out of the box. Yet millions swear by this version of Android, and lots of people love to try it and laud it from afar. So while the Nexus is no more, the Pixel has, rightly or wrongly, become the new Nexus. To many, it's seen as the true Android variant. It's simultaneously the most up-to-date, the most updated, and that is sometimes used as a key selling point, although it isn't mentioned as drastically as it probably once was in marketing material. Public perception of Android, especially in North America, still views the platform with caution, lacking updates, poor updates, maybe a little bit hacky. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Google Pixel phones prove that iOS isn't always the smoothest, and the default Android experience is more than alive and well. You might notice that the Google Pixel series, despite numerous foibles over the years, still receives accolades and ringing endorsements from across the industry, ourselves included. But the truth is, it hasn't always been easy to recommend a Pixel phone, and at times, it still isn't. There are always caveats to every product, but the list of drawbacks has been shrinking year after year with Google phones. Overheating, bad battery life, and poor performance are most of the problems that are, I'd say, more or less gone. Although it is worth noting that no Tensor processor will ever beat the best, there's always room for improvement there, but there are no complaints from normies or the normal people out there about the phone chips inside these devices, and in most cases, those are the people buying the lion's share of smartphones globally. That said, it's not something that Google should rest on. They should definitely start improving the Tensor series to make it more competitive. Take a look at the various awards, though, from online and in-print publications that Pixel phones have received. It's not an isolated thing either. When everyone is lauding a product, I do think there is bound to be intrigue from the potential buying public. So far, though, that hasn't really translated to a major market shift. But there's a little bit of a murmur there under the surface. Google is also coy at increasing global availability. I think this is something that I personally think they should definitely do. And as of 2026, only 33 countries have official purchase channels for Google Pixel phones. That's a really small pool, but that could change pretty darn quickly if Google just released their phones in more countries. With around 1 to 2% of the global smartphone market share, it's actually shocking to see how often Pixel phones are discussed compared to how many people are actively using one out there in the real world. If slow growth is a play, then Google is definitely being very, very patient with its premier phone lineup, and they have been patient since its very inception. I would point out one key thing here, though. Google has really started to take smartphones a lot more seriously over the past 3 to 4 years. The soft reboot of the lineup with the Pixel 6 has kind of felt like a catalyst for growth, no matter how small, at least at this stage. And to that end, some of the growth is owed to the switch from an off-the-shelf chipset from Qualcomm to an internally developed Tensor processor. This debuted 4 years ago with the Pixel 6 series, and it's been on a bit of a strange trajectory ever since then. Tensor, or the Tensor G1 we'll call it from now on, was fundamentally flawed with overheating, poor power efficiency, throttling, and modem issues. It sat as well below the best of Snapdragon back in 2021. Only with the Pixel 10's Tensor G5 chip have we seen most of those major problems eliminated, although I would say performance when compared to Qualcomm and MediaTek has suffered quite dramatically, and that's something that we kind of need to see Google make improvements with, as Google's flagship chip barely lands a paw on the Snapdragon Dimensity processors today in benchmarks and in raw performance metrics. Gaming performance has also been a truly elusive area for every Tensor chip since its launch. I think it's a tool used to bash Pixel devices, rightly or wrongly, but it could be worse before it kind of gets better, which is something that, yeah, you might not want to hear. Nobody, though, I think, is buying a Pixel phone exclusively for gaming on the go or that high-level performance. That said, you can play practically everything on these phones. The problem is that it might not provide, or it will provide, a less than optimal experience compared to many of the phones that you can go out and buy from the top shelf of Android. What's more interesting is the fact that this change has coincided as well with a big uptick in interest and sales of the Pixel lineup. It kind of seems like Pixel phones are selling not because people want the best specifications, and that is a little bit goes against what we expect from the buying public. This is where we hit a little bit of a disconnect from what we see and read online and what's actually happening. Google started making phones that offered the best off-the-shelf specs and components available. And in recent years, the company's leaned more into the bespoke, and that means that the performance is not quite where it should be. They've built or designed from the ground up, and those devices don't quite hit the same performance standards as those that out there, you, for instance, may know what you want and expect from a smartphone. And that I do think the Nexus years, in tandem with the original Pixel through to the Pixel 4, that phone being the last out-and-out true Pixel flagship, may have inadvertently set unrealistic expectations for the series as it is now. Ardent tech nerds do expect the best in every area. Sometimes I do as well, and that includes every single internal component. And it's never been more apparent that a Pixel cannot offer that, even at a premium price point, which I think is one of the biggest sticking points. I can't help but feel that the A series has helped Google kind of better understand what areas or what key areas of its devices they need to make for their phones, and they will be important long into the future as a result of that. And I do think the A series ties into the idea of a minimal viable product. It's something you could easily level as criticism at any recent Pixel phone, making doing the bare minimum to make something sellable to people. I will take the camera as an individual component of this, or an example of this on any Pixel. We have seen major gains across the entire industry, yet Google still holds on to pure consistency alone, and older, smaller, arguably less capable sensors on its smartphone hardware. A Pixel camera does just work, and it works well, though, in practically every single scenario. This extends to lots of areas within the Pixel lineup. The experience is almost identical front to back, no matter which phone you choose, A series to the latest Pro tier model, foldables notwithstanding. I think dependability and reliability are a surefire way to have people coming back time after time, and Google has lent into that a lot more readily in the last few years. I think maybe this is a symptom, though, of the wider smartphone industry. We haven't really seen any major breakthrough, at least in Western markets, for a number of years. In China, it's a little bit different, especially with regards to camera hardware. I think most 3 or 4 year old flagship phones are going to be very comparable to the newest technology, unless you look really closely or really intently. Gemini and adjacent AI functionality is kind of how the Google lineup has differentiated itself almost from the very, very get-go. These features are less reliant on the raw internals and bleed into the background a little bit more readily. Think things like spam detection, call screening, hold for me. Google's really way ahead of the curve in these lifestyle-oriented functions that do genuinely benefit your life. Throw in the increased software support windows, which is now up at 7 years, that are only really matched by Samsung on Android and Apple on the other side of the fence. And you can see why many people may have switched over to the Pixel lineup and are thinking of upgrading to a Pixel in future. Not many people have ever experienced one. That might be a little bit of a problem. So even after 10 versions, it could be seen as a novel experience from the outside looking in. So yeah, it might be a benefit or a blessing in disguise. In the US, Google has actually targeted iPhone users quite a lot, but seemingly is picking up Samsung defectors, which is another odd component of this entire situation. With OnePlus now leaving the region, and at least in an official capacity, and Motorola the only other brand to really make a dent outside of those established 2 main players, Google phones have seen really steady market share increases to just under 5% of this space, which, again, is not going to set the world alight, but it's a damn sight better than it was a few years ago. It's a tiny fraction, but it's a growing fraction that is backed by billion-dollar marketing campaigns. And as Gemini as a product keeps growing, so too does the Pixel lineup with it as it's marketed as the Gemini phone. Apple is stumbling in its own AI efforts and AI integrations, but Google is kind of leading the charge. And I do think the Pixel acts as the tip of the spear there for people who care about AI functionality. Sure, I do think a lot of it is kind of fluff coated in gold leaf, but some functions are clearly proving useful and enticing at a time when our phones have never really felt any more samey. We kind of had the same phones for the past decade using the same applications we've used for the past decade. But can we continue to see the Pixel lineup growing? And I think this is the million-dollar question, and there's probably no true answer. Over the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen Google throw serious money at building Pixel brand awareness for a start, sponsoring international sporting teams, national teams, the NBA finals, and endorsing all kinds of events and the things that I do think helps increase visibility. People clearly want an alternative to the Samsung and Apple duopoly, especially in the United States, and I do think Google is in a great position to pick up stragglers and build a reliable customer base who come back year after year. I think if the company can get close to 10% of that US market, then that would be a genuinely huge statement and a great success story, at least given the fact that they've only really been in this game for about 10 years properly. It won't worry those bigger players, but it would genuinely be a big achievement. In the rest of the world, the competition is much more fierce. The fact that you can get more for your money with the brands like Xiaomi, Oppo, Honor, and others out there, I think makes it a little bit more difficult. However, you can only buy the Pixel in 33 countries around the globe via official channels, as I noted earlier on this video. I think slowly adding more to that list will undoubtedly increase the number of people using Pixel phones across the planet, which is, again, another win for Google. But being realistic, I do think the sky is not the limit for the Pixel, but there is definitely more than enough room at the table for Google to keep a seat warm. I want to ask you though, can you foresee the Pixel lineup being as prevalent in future? Or is this a house of cards waiting to topple? In fact, if you use a Pixel, let me know why. I'm really intrigued to hear why you use a Pixel, why you love a Pixel, or if you're looking to pick one up very, very soon. As I say, let me know all of your thoughts down in the comment sections below. But hopefully this has given you an insight as to how Google kind of hangs in there with the best in the business. But until next time, I'll speak to you later.